All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for an SSELA webinar on geography. My name is Greg Fredericks, and I'm the Regional Coordinator for Social Studies and Blended Learning. And I'm very excited and happy to be joined by some of my colleagues today, chiefly Donna Merlau, who's going to be presenting on unlocking geographic reasoning. And I'm going to turn it over to Donna at this point. And thank you again for presenting, Donna.
You're welcome, Greg. My name is Donna Merlau. I am a social studies consultant for the PNW BOCES SSELA, and I'm also a teacher consultant for the New York Geographic Alliance. I'm also happy to have our colleague Linda Brandon here to help us with this. I want you to know that if you have questions as we go, I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask questions. If we don't get to every slide in the set, it'll still be part of the recording, but the last several slides are ways to look at essential skills related to geography and some questions that you can ask that are geographically oriented. So it's a way for you to pivot off of this work. There's also contact information at the end. So if you're interested in more information about geographic reasoning, you can contact me, and my contact information is in there, and I'll put it in the chat at the end. And there's also information for Greg, so that if other webinars like this or sessions like this are warranted or needed or wanted, they could be scheduled. Okay, Greg. So I've got three objectives today, and that's to explain what geographic reasoning is, to introduce geographic ideas, vocabulary, and skills, and to discuss ways that will help students develop geographic reasoning skills. I'm going to blend all three of these as I go, and you'll hear me start to talk about some of the language and skills as it relates to geographic reasoning and giving you ways that you might have your students execute those. Okay. So what comes to mind when you think of geographic reasoning? And Greg is going to put in the chat a link for a Jamboard, and anything that comes to mind when you're thinking about geography, if you could put it on a Post-it note and put it on the page, that would be helpful.
If you're not familiar with Jamboard, if you go to the left-hand side, you'll notice that there are 8 icons. The fourth icon down is the sticky note function. And if you click on the sticky note function, it opens up a virtual sticky note, which you can type into. When you click save, it will generate a sticky note, and then you can drag and drop that anywhere on the screen.
We could take the next minute or so to think about that and put your thoughts in there. We'll go from there. Anything that comes to mind when you think of geography or teaching geography, what are the things that you think about?
You also are more comfortable in using the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that's fine as well. I'm always happy to play the role of scribe.
Especially since we're small, so whatever works best for you.
Thanks for sharing that one out, Patrick.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for that one, Madalena. Put that in there. Give it a few more seconds.
Okay. Let's talk about this for a minute. Patrick, can you elaborate on the struggle that students have?
They seem to always have a hard time whenever geography comes up, and like the reason why I put geographic context up there was the sense that they have a hard time telling that story, explaining the situation of how geography has an impact per se. And as far as like locating items and trying to explain directions, I've always seen that my students have had a challenge with that.
Okay. And Madalena, did you want to say anything about confusion over how to teach it at the elementary level?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm actually have been a high school person my whole life, so I'm dabbling into the elementary world. So this is one of the reasons why I'm on this webinar, to see what resources and things that are out there to offer. But geography, I think in general, is something that students struggle with, but it's so important in understanding history in general. So I always hear students forget, you know, the teachers spend times on geography and it's something that they constantly forget. It could be a month later, it could be the next school year over. So it's not something that sticks with students. They have difficulty with it. Teachers have even said, oh, I don't think they taught geography last year, you know, the previous teacher. So it's something that students struggle with understanding and I guess keeping in their memory and understanding it, I guess. And it's not just at the elementary level. I think it's across, even when they get to the high school. I do. And I think it's a fundamental, important piece of understanding history. And students do just struggle with kind of, you know, recollection of it or even understanding it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks both to Patrick and Madalena for their comments and their ideas. Let's go to the next slide, Greg, if we could. So, oops. So geography is not memorizing place names on a map. That's what it's not. So a lot of times when teachers teach it, they say, well, you need to know where China is, you need to know where this is, but kids don't have any connection to any place else. So it's not like this is China and it's this amount of distance or located in an east-west, some sort of orientation direction from the US, or it's near the Pacific Ocean. There's no connection. It's only, here's the place, here's the location of this place, I'm all done. So understanding more about that. It's not an inventory of peoples and their cultures. So it's not, well, there's this group who lives here in this region and they speak this language and wear these clothes. That's not helpful either, because in no one place, even New York State, do we all look the same, talk the same, or live in the same climate? Because if we live up in the mountainous areas, we may experience weather than if we live on the coastal areas of either the Atlantic or the Long Island Sound, or on Lake Ontario or Lake Erie. So understanding that there's a wider gate there. It's not limited to particular places and periods in time. A lot of times history wants to say, well, it's happening here, and then they worry all about the dates and the chronology, but they don't worry about what's in that place or why somebody might be interested in that place. And sometimes we're stereotypical. Kid might say, well, there's elephants in Africa, or there's elephants in Southeast Asia. but that's all they know about that place. They don't know anything else. That's the only connection that they have. So it's skewed. And geography can't be separate from students' personal experiences. So geography has to be connected to the kids. If we're going to expect kids to be able to transfer this information, it has to be real to them. Have any of you ever watched Friends? Did you ever see the episode where Ross buys the couch and he can't get it up the stairs? He must say 150 times, pivot, pivot, pivot. That's because that's spatial. It's spatial. We need to think about how big or small or shaped something is and whether we can move it or not move it. So geography isn't just about maps. It's about where something is and what's there, where, location, what's there, place, and how these places are related to one another. So when you're thinking about putting furniture in a room, you have to know what the space of it is. You have to know what the shape of it is. When you're with kids in a school, there's a layout to a classroom. I can talk about that as geography. I can have kids say things like, Mrs. or Mr. So-and-so's desk is across from mine. Across. That's a geo word, right? Because it's positional. So thinking in a wider way about geography. Okay, Greg. So if I look at this image and I teach geography from it, and you can unmute to tell me whatever you see or think you see, or, you know, the kinds of questions I might ask about it. Hi, Carolyn, no problem. So what do you see here? And can I teach geography from this? What do you think? Okay, Carolyn, what can you tell me about climate? Can you unmute yourself? We're small.
Sure, sorry, there's other kids in
Yeah,
here.
there's no problem. I understand.
I'll go now. So yeah, what I was thinking is you could tell it looks like a dry place. It looks to be perhaps like a hot place. And then I was also looking just at the landform of it, you know, the desert. So I don't know, that's what I would take away from the picture.
Okay. Patrick, any takeaways?
I was kind of picking up on similar points there, the type of food, maybe some of the customs.
Okay. Lifestyle adaptations, perhaps. Madalena, any thoughts?
Yeah, those are the same similar ones that I was thinking about, but also how they're dressed for the
Okay.
climate, you know, for.
Do we know where it is? Can we put a location to this? We think it's dry because of the land looks dry, right? Looks flat. There's food in front of them. Do we know where this is? Can we put a where to this? Okay, Carolyn's saying maybe Africa. Yes, no, maybe. Okay, Patrick agrees. All right, so we kind of asked geographic questions about this. We think it might be Africa. We probably need to do some more research. We can look at the features there. It looks like it's got a dry climate, and climate's different than weather. Weather's day to day. Climate's the pattern over a 30-year period. We see they're dressed in a particular way, and we see that there's food in front of them. This happens to be a refugee camp in Chad for the Sudanese. The food in front of them is their food for a week. This was part of a series of photographs taken by Peter Menzel and used in his book, Hungry Planet, What the World Eats. He and his wife, Faith Deluja, were studying the global marketplace. But if this is the only image I see of Africa, that's problematic, because then kids only think of Africa as kids not having a lot of food. It's all dry. I don't see any cities. Next one, Greg. So this is a poem by a young lady who was about 14 when she wrote it. She lived in New York State. She was an immigrant here, had been here for 7 years. This is what she writes. I'm cool like that. I'm proud like that. And I'm African like that. Not a bloated stomach, not a face encircled by flies, not a beggar's hand. I'm part of 1 billion people with 1 million dances and 1,000 tongues to tell not only stories of tears, to play not only in the morning band. I have a direct link to the origin of all humanity and shout this fact with my lungs filled with the sands of the Sahara and the Kalahari. How does my picture change if I went from the first impression of place, Africa, region, Africa, which is a large continental region? How does it change my perception with this poem, which is geographic? The way that students might apply what they see here to an entire continent reminds me of
The danger of a single story.
True. True. And that's why we have to be careful about how we put things together. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Africa is not a country, right? It's 54 countries. It's 3 territories controlled by others, and it's a disputed territory in the Western Sahara of Morocco zone, where Morocco and the people who live in Western Sahara have an ongoing dispute because the people of Western Sahara want independence. But notice that I'm using a number of different documents, and they're not maps, to help kids think about what this place, Africa, is like. So the location of Africa has the equator that goes through it, right? And it's part of the Eastern Hemisphere with a small part in the Western Hemisphere. It's also incorporated into the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. So all 4 hemispheres run, Africa is in all 4 hemispheres. So getting a wider picture of what that is and thinking about where that is and how it interacts with other places. Go ahead, Greg. So geography is the study of the Earth's surface. I do look at landforms. It does include the interaction of people, the environment, and resources. It answers the question why, or excuse me, where and why there, and why that's significant. So what, right? And it's spatial. Spatial means that it is in relation to other things. There's distance, and we can measure distance in time as well as in miles or kilometers, right? So if I am going home to Rochester and I am running at rush hour, I may want to go a particular way that day, then another way, because of the traffic I'm going to run into or the other issues I'm going to run into. Spatial means that it has a shape or dimension to it. There's size to it. It's connected to other places. Where in history, people organize information based on time and time periods. In geography, people organize things around space and how people connect across space, where it is and why it's there and what's there. Okay. So some vocabulary words I've been tossing around. Words like location, place, region, scale, pattern, processes, connections, and mental maps. These are all words that I would want my students to be playing around with, even if they're in elementary. What's the location of my desk in this classroom? If I've got rows, perhaps I'm the 3rd row from the door, and the second seat in. If I'm tables, I can look at it that way. If I'm in a circle, how many from whatever starting point that I use to that spot? Once I'm there, notice that I'm giving directions in reference to other places. Think about it. If you're trying to tell somebody how to get to your house, you use landmarks, right? Turn left at the Sunoco station. Go through 4 stoplights and make a right. On your left, you'll see a 7-Eleven or whatever it happens to be, a school. Little kids can tell you how to navigate in their house, how to get from their bedroom to the kitchen. They can draw it. They might, if they're riding the bus, be able to tell you how many turns the bus makes, because you could ask them to do that. Those are all geographic concepts that are getting at location and the location of their house versus the location of the school or wherever you've got them going. If you want to keep it confined to the school, how do I get from my teacher's room to the cafeteria? How do I get from my teacher's room to the music room, the gym, the cafeteria? In my room, what are the things that are there that make it Mrs. So-and-so's room or Mr. So-and-so's room? So that I'm talking about that place, what's there? Are there regions in the school or regions in the classroom? Regions have something in common in them. In other words, where something else is like it. So is there a region in the school or places in the school where you have entertainment? And when I ask kids that, some of them will say the playground, some of them will say the gym, some of them will say the band room, depending upon whether they're eligible for band or the music room, but they'll tell you what those places are because they see those things as entertaining. So I can start to build those concepts in simple ways in a classroom, in a school building. I can look at scale. Scale tells me whether I'm zooming in or zooming out, right? So if I zoom in, I'm looking at a very close, smaller space than if I zoom out and it's much wider. I can look at scale on a local level, on a regional level, on a global level. So depending upon what grade level I'm working with, I can work with scale. Pattern deals with, when I see these connections, what does it look like? So we'll look at some things that have a pattern. If you thought about, for example, if you've ever seen Cars by Disney, Disney's movie Cars takes place right on a highway going from one competition for cars to another, and he gets pushed off the highway somewhere else. So the pattern of traffic, the pattern of where you've got crime, the pattern of where battles took place and land was taken. I can look at lots of different patterns, but there are usually processes connected to those patterns, things like trade, colonization. I can look at transportation. I can look at deforestation. There are lots of processes, things that are done to the land or across the land that shape pattern. I can say that there's a concentration of people in an area, or there's a dispersion, it's scattered. They're not as deeply settled. So that would help me think about urban, rural, and suburban, right? So in a rural area, it's going to be lightly settled. There'll be distances between farms and houses. In an urban area, they're tightly settled. So it's a pattern of how my housing works, of how my streets are arranged. Connections. Connections are how we link between places and regions. And mental maps are our own constructs our ways of understanding the world. So when you have a kid draw what the layout of their house is, or what their bedroom looks like, that's a mental map. How do you get to school? That's a mental map. If I've got a question on an exam that asks me about Iraq, but I have no map in my head about where Iraq is, it's going to be harder for me to answer that question. Okay. So there's three big ideas that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to do them consecutively. This is the first one. Yep, go ahead, Greg. Spatial patterns in organizations of human society are arranged according to political, historical, cultural, and economic factors. So let's look at the next slide. What am I seeing here? This is an image taken from space. It's a time-lapse image. What am I seeing? Am I seeing any patterns? Can I see anything that I can point out? The eastern side is lit up more. Yep. Okay, anything else? Lights associated with communities and population and where they're clustered, right? So I can see the lights clustered in particular areas. Why don't I have a lot of lights in that area? Yes, right there. Why don't I have a lot of lights there? Perhaps, but there's something else in the United States that would make this harder to live in. What else can you tell me? There is some water there. Perhaps. That's where the Rocky Mountains are. So it's high elevation. It's not easy to build there. It's not easy to farm there. So I have fewer lights there. If I look at New York State, right, and I'm looking at areas that don't have a lot of population, can I see the Adirondacks? Greg, if you could do that line right under Lake Ontario there. That's the same line where I have major cities, where the Erie Canal used to be functional as a major trade route. Now it's a tourist route, right? So I can see where those population centers are. I can have conversations with kids about the impact of landforms on where people settle. I can ask them to tease out what they see. Do you see any grid-like patterns on this map? There's grids there because when it was settled, they set up things in a grid-like pattern, right, from the Northwest Territory. And so their street patterns and their settlement patterns were based on township and range. So I have that grid pattern. So I can look for patterns here where I've got linear settlements, where I've got grid-like areas, and try to think about why that is and get kids to tease that out. By using something like this and letting them tell you what they see and then explore the whys of it, you're making connections for kids, and kids are making connections to the United States. And I can do that with landforms and with this, which is economic, right? I've got a grid that allows me to have electricity. It's also political, right? Because Biden has just said he wants to upgrade this system because without it, we're going to have other kinds of issues. So there are political situations that are also tied to this. Go ahead, Greg. So recognizing and interpreting at different scales, the relationships between patterns. Can you go back, Greg, for just a second? Do we have just one country on this map? Patrick shaking his head, no. What countries do we have on this map? We've got Mexico. Do we have any other country? We do have Canada. So we've got North America. We've also got a little bit of the Caribbean off to the east of Florida. So we've got areas in North America. The concentration here, the primary region of focus is the US, but it's not the only region that's on this map. Okay, Greg. All right, take the next one, please. So if I'm looking at this map and I'm looking at patterns, is there any connection between an industrial region, a major industrial center, and resources? Can you see any connections there between those three things? Major industrial center, industrial region, resources. Is there any connection there? Okay, what do you think the connection is? Carolyn or Madalena, any thoughts on what you think the connection is?
I just realized the kid left so I can talk. I don't know. The only thing I was noticing is when I looked at the industrial regions in black and then looking for within those industrial regions, if there are industrial centers, it's kind of narrowing it down. And then located by one of those is a coal field.
Okay, so industrial region, industrial center located near a resource. So I'm going to put my industrial regions and centers near where I have to perhaps process a resource. And part of that will depend on how I have to process that resource. So if I'm manufacturing steel, I want to be in an area where I have both access to iron, right, and coal so that I can smelt. If I'm manufacturing something like sodas, I don't want to have to ship it a long way. I want to manufacture close to where my market is, because when I put the liquid into whatever I'm making, whatever drink I'm making, it's heavy. So it'll cost me more to ship it. So where I locate a business is dependent on what the weight of it is, how far I have to ship it, what I'm making, right? So I'm looking at all kinds of connections here. And here we're looking at primarily Mexico, although the Caribbean islands are highlighted here and the southern portion of the United States is highlighted. Let's look at the next map, please. Okay, in this map, what's the process that's being taken place? I'm going to talk about process first. And process helps me with connection. So, right, I've got trade going on here. Anything interesting in terms of the trade? Any patterns that you see? Any patterns that you see? And I saw Patrick wrote that he saw cars going in both directions, which means that they're probably both putting parts in or working on those cars. I've got coal in the United States. I've got aluminum in Canada. But if I remember the map that I just looked at, so previous slide, would tell me that there's aluminum also in the area of the Caribbean. So these cars that are being manufactured may be moving across more than just Canada and the United States, right? There, or the manufacture of, let's say, cans for soft drinks or that kind of thing, may be moving in different directions here. But trade is the process. The connection is what they are selling back and forth, whether it's manufactured or it's a resource. Okay, Greg. All right, so big idea number 2, there are complex relationships of cause and effect existing among people, their environments, and historical and contemporary actions. So there may have been actions in the past that have shaped that land that have an impact today. They did something. Climate change, when we talk about that, and you talk about the industries that developed in the 1800s, is one of those historical situations that modified the land that has a contemporary impact. Okay. So if I'm trying to reason geographically, I'm identifying, describing, and evaluating the relationship between people, places, regions, and environments using geographic tools. And I'm placing them in a spatial context in relationship to one another. We've done that, I think, when we looked at the Africa information. We've done that when we just looked at the map of lights at night. We've done that when we looked at the maps of manufacturing, right, which is a process, and then the trade that results, process. Okay. So what are we looking at here? Obviously, we're looking at a region. All of those lighter yellow areas have something in common, right? So a region, this one would be a formal one, would be that there's something in common here. What's the in common? Any ideas or thoughts? If I think that the equator runs through, yep, you're right, there are areas near the equator. That's good, Carolyn, I like it. Yep, so it's going to run just south, Greg, of the Horn in Africa. Right. So what do these places have in common if they're close to the equator? Think vegetation. Look at South America. What would be going on there that I might be able to apply that idea to the other areas? Any ideas? Rainforest. It represents rainforest. Notice in Africa how much smaller that rainforest area is. It's not all of Africa. When kids think of Africa and they're thinking of zebras and other kinds of animals, they think rainforest and it's really savanna. So it's the wrong application. These areas are around the equator, but they are where you have rainforest. Okay, next one. This looks at deforestation. You thought rainforest, but was thrown off by Africa? Ooh, I'm sorry about that. That's not a worry. But see, that's one of those things where kids might say, I think it's rainforest. Then you can give them other sources to go and look and say, let's try and test that theory, right? That's an inquiry kind of basis, but we're using a different tool to get at that. Same thing can be done with deserts. And by the way, you can have deserts up in Greenland because it doesn't get a lot of precipitation and it's cold, but it's very dry. So then you're debunking some of those myths that kids have, but you pique their interest. You presented them with a problem that they need to solve. So in this case, what's the process? Look at the title.
Deforestation.
Right. I'm deforesting an area. That's correct. And so what are reasons that I'm deforesting? Well, I'm raising cattle there. I'm putting in things to harvest oil seeds. I'm logging. I might be growing cereals there that are not rice and wheat. I might be growing paddy rice there or other crops. And the paddy rice would probably be in Southeast Asia. So I'm deforesting for these reasons. So those areas in the previous slide, Greg, if we can go back just for a second, are under threat because of what's in that chart. So trying to get kids to connect those two things and think about, well, where would the cattle raising be? And why would they be doing that? Or where would the paddy rice be? And that's in that Southeast Asia zone north of Australia. So I'm looking at reasons that they deforest and then trying to apply it back here. So I'm looking for that relationship again. Okay, Greg. Okay. So I'm identifying and analyzing and evaluating the relationship between the environment and human activities. How the physical environment is being modified. It's being deforested. It's a process. Humans are doing that. By the way, you modify the environment when you build a house or build a road or build a canal. Anytime I am taking the space and what it looked like naturally and changing it, I'm modifying it. And I'm also looking at how human activities are influenced by the Earth's physical features and processes. Climate, earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, right? Earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, those are all processes that are part of the Earth. Rain, desert, okay. So this is erosion. And erosion here is happening in Alaska. And it's happening because the permafrost isn't staying frozen. And you've got icebergs and ice that are melting. So I've only got small patches of ice up at the top of that image. Yes, Carolyn, I could say that the 5 themes are part of my geographic reasoning, right? But I don't want to teach them as this is just movement. I want to show how they're interconnected. Initially, the 5 themes came out somewhere around 1988. National Geographic and the alliances went with geographic standards, the national ones, and went to 6 elements, but they overlap. And so you keep hearing me say things like location, place, region, right? Movement. And then I need to talk about connection. So this is erosion. Next slide, Greg. This is also a map on erosion, but I'm looking at something else. I'm not looking at climate change necessarily. I'm looking at what humans are doing that are causing wind and water erosion. And they're growing crops. So they've taken something off the land, and when the wind and water come through, it washes soil away. I can use this map to look at patterns. I can see the Mississippi River here, and it's being washed down the Mississippi. I can see where a lot of our cropped land is located. I can have conversations about why that is. I could look at this wind and water erosion. And wind and water are part of the natural world, right? But we've exacerbated it by what we've done in modifying the land. I could look at this and the Great Depression and the period of the Dust Bowl are similar areas experiencing some sort of erosion, right? Because the wind was terrible during that time period and you had erosion. So if I looked at those two maps, would I see any correlation at all? Not necessarily a cause and effect, but are they happening in similar spots? Is this an area vulnerable to wind and water erosion? Okay. And Greg, how are we on time?
We have about 12 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So in this case, this is a picture book. It's called Ducks Overboard, A True Story of Plastics in Our Ocean. It came out this year. And what you see here is trade, the process of trade. And you see a container ship. And a storm came up and knocked containers off the boat. And 28,000 rubber duckies ended up in the ocean. Now, Eric Carle has a book called 10 Little Rubber Ducks. And he looks at a cardboard box of ducks that went overboard. This looks at the container itself. And all those yellow dots, those are the ducks. And they end up in the gyres, the garbage patches in each of the oceans. So if I want to get at human action, containers, trade, process, and how sometimes that can go wrong if a storm comes up, those rubber ducks are a form of pollution, right? And they're also going to travel all over the world. So I can map where the ducks go. I can look at a variety of different topics around this. Go ahead, Greg. So if I'm adapting to the environment, it's my behavior. What am I doing differently? This is a picture from Antarctica, and I'm bundling up because it's cold. Okay. But how do I modify my environment? It's cold. I can't change the temperature per se, but I can use a thermostat in my house to raise it, right? So I've modified what the natural environment of the temperature is by heating my home. Okay, Greg. So in this case, I know that I'm near water and that it's prone to flooding. So instead of building my house flat to the land, I'm going to adapt to my environment by building it on stilts. I want to raise it up so the water goes underneath it. How have I modified the environment? I've built on it, right? But I've changed my practice. I've adapted to it being prone to flooding. Another adaptation may be I don't settle near the water, I settle further inland. I've changed my human behavior versus modifying what I've done to the land. Now, I can't not have floods. I can't not have volcanoes erupt. I can't not have tsunamis, et cetera, but I can try to modify the environment to mitigate or limit how badly people are impacted. And I can adapt my behavior to do that. Okay, Greg. Same thing here. I have adapted by wearing light clothes because it's a warm climate. I have modified the environment by digging canals so that I can water my crops. I've settled near water. So I've adapted to my environment by settling near the water so that I can grow crops, but I've modified it so that I can get the water to the crops. Okay. So a spatial perspective allows for a focus on the way phenomena are related to one another in particular places, which in turn allows for the examination of human organization, and its environmental consequences. Okay. So I've got 3 continents here. How are they related to one another? And can you tell me what the continents are? Okay, so Carolyn, you're saying 1 is Africa, 2 is South America, and 3 is Europe. Is that correct? All righty, we're golden. Are they positioned here properly? Would I move them on the page in order to put them in correct geographic proximity? Nice proximity, right? Word, vocabulary that I can use with kids, and then stand near somebody and say, I'm in proximity to you, so that I can play with those words that do location. So I might want kids to take those 3 pieces and rearrange them, right? 3, Europe, would be north of Africa. South America would be to the west of Africa and west of Europe. All 3 were connected by trade. They were connected by the slave trade in particular, right? So I can talk about what those relationships were and how they interact. Okay, Greg. So recognizing and analyzing how place and regions influence the social, cultural, and economic characteristics of civilizations, empires, states, societies. In the case that we just looked at, growing sugar in South America and the Caribbean affected that trade relationship and the desire by Europeans to have labor that they didn't have to pay for, and results in a slave trade. Okay. So if I'm looking at this, I can talk about, this is a picture book on the Ganges of India. These women are putting flowers in the water for the cremains of relatives. They're celebrating, it's a tradition. If that's the only picture of India I show, I'm doing kids a disservice, but I can talk about what happens at the Ganges and how it's got cultural connections, okay? Characterizing and analyzing changing connections between places and regions. That Ganges River is still sacred to anyone who is a Hindu and also has connections to Buddhism. I can also look at the Ganges River as being very polluted, not only by the cremains that are put in there, but also by the industrial dumping and the pollution runoff from sewers. So how that affects the traditional use of that water. Okay. I can look at the settlement of the Iowa, Nebraska area. I can look at the process, railroads movement, right? I'm moving people into that area. How does that change who was living there and what was on the land and how it's been modified because I'm moving a bunch of people into it, okay? I can look at this as being possibly New York City because of the iconic buildings in the back and the Statue of Liberty. But I've also got movement of immigration in, and I've got a war going on. So I need food to feed my troops who are going out. So how are these things impacting the land? My neighborhoods change when I move different groups of people in. There are different restaurants, different stores, different ways of interactions between people. And if I need to grow more food, then I'm putting more land under the plow. Okay, Greg. So asking geographic questions about where places are located, why the locations of these places are important, and how the locations of these places are related to other locations and people. All of what I've been doing the entire time we've been talking, mostly me, is telling you how these things link up and doing those types of questions. Go ahead, Greg. So in Flint, Michigan, I'm looking at a mural that was done where they have water that is poison, and I see the skull and crossbones. I see the woman screaming in the act because of the acidity of the water. So I am getting an image of Flint, Michigan from this poster. I can use this to talk about pollution or other things in that area. And what else do I want to know about Flint, Michigan? This is a starting point, not an ending point. Okay. I can use spatial vocabulary. This is Rosie's Walk. I might use this book with my kindergartners to say, hey, she walked across the yard. She walked under the bridge. She walked over the pond. All of the words in this are spatial. They tell me location and connection. Okay, great. Mental maps, as I've said earlier, are conceptions of a spatial arrangement of something. What your bedroom looks like, how you get to work, what your activity space is. They're based on people's experiences, right? They can have smells to them. I can orient myself and say, oh yes, if I was in this place, I would smell this. That might be a place in a mall, right? In a Macy's, there's that perfume section. It might be my favorite food in a particular neighborhood, etc. Okay. So mental maps are fluid. We add to them. We change them all the time. And they're informed by information and perceptions. Smells, sounds, sights. Go ahead. So in this case, I'm using As the Crow Flies, which is in the 2nd grade. And As the Crow Flies shows me Rabbit's activity space. This is where Rabbit is moving around. It's the garden. It's his home. It's that zone. It's a map, but it's the mental map of where Rabbit is, seen from the air by the crow. Okay. In this case, Lucy in the City is a 2nd grade book, and Lucy's lost from her parents. And so she's trying to find her way home. In this case, we're using orientation, north, south, east, west. And we're following a grid pattern, street patterns, right? And Lucy remembers the smell of popcorn, which she associates with movie theater. So Owl is flying like Crow flew over the area and is telling her, hey, Lucy, if you go, right, the movie theater is a few blocks east, right? It's 1 block east and then 3 blocks north. So that tells her how she needs to move. That's an orientation kind of thing. I can take a compass in a classroom and actually mark in my room where original north, south, east, and west are, and then have kids do directions or a Simon Says kind of game or something else to play with those directions. I used to do it also with countries. Like if my room was China, where would a particular river be? Where would I find the Pacific Ocean or the Yellow Sea or whatever? So I can do lots of different kinds of things to help kids play in that zone, but I need to use the language and be explicit about it. I need to do it with fidelity, and I need to do it in an explicit way. Okay, great. So mental maps are important because they help kids organize information about the world they live in. Have kids draw their mental maps. That'll tell you what they do know and what they don't know, and then you can work from there. Have them draw directional maps from home to school or directional maps within the school. Trade them with other kids to say, do I agree or disagree? What do we need to modify? Okay, how are we time-wise?
We are at 4:01.
Okay, so do you want me to run through these last 4 slides or do you want me to let it go? I want to be mindful of people's time.
Finish it with, I would say finish it with fidelity, Donna.
Okay. All right. So when you're asking geo questions and you're working with geo skills, it's where, why, so what? It's acquiring geographic information, finding it, gathering it, processing it, and using a variety of sources. You saw me use satellite maps. You saw me use poetry. You saw me use children's books. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. I used charts and photographs. So lots of different ways that you can gather information and have kids relate spatially, geographically to it. Okay. Analyzing geographic information means that I'm identifying key characteristics and trends and relationships. What are those processes and patterns? I'm answering questions and drawing conclusions and making generalizations. Notice I didn't want to make any generalizations about that first image of Africa because we didn't have enough information. Go ahead. And it can be written or oral. You can create a PowerPoint. You can do lots of different ways of presenting that information out. Geographic questions include things like, does it have a location? Are there patterns that emerge across the space that you see? What's the scale? Am I zoomed in, zoomed out, local, regional, international, or global? Okay. And then what are relationships and connections between locations? Why are these places connected? What about them? I would also say to you that power shifts when you have resources shift. So oil is big now. Those countries that have oil are important. The countries that have heavy metals that are used to create those special batteries in electric cars or chips and batteries for phones are going to be up and coming. And whoever controls or helps them dig out those resources is going to be an important player in the world. So power can shift based on other kinds of things. So what are those connections and what are those relationships? What are they based on? What gives this location meaning? What processes are taking place within this location and between other locations? Okay. If you've got any questions or want any more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you in whatever way I can provide information related to geography. If you think this session was valuable and you want others that pivot off of it or more of these kinds of things, then you need to let Greg know so that he can schedule that. Any takeaways from this as we send you forward to have a nice long weekend?
I got a lot of really good ideas and resources from this. I wrote down the name of that book, Sacred River. I think I want to use that in class. And I loved the connection that you made for me where it's not just showing the map, it's then showing the map with something else, you know, a chart, having them make connections with that. I wrote down, I have a bunch of stuff that I wrote down about things that I want to use. Putting cardinal directions on the walls, I'm going to do that and then have them use that to say like, oh, which direction will we go to whatever place, you know? Yeah, lots of good stuff. And to answer your question, yeah, I'd love more workshops like this. I think this was really valuable. So thank you. And I apologize again for being late.
There are no worries.
I also want to say thank you, and I apologize. There's end of the day cleaning going on in the background with some music and some vacuum cleaners and things like that. So I apologize. Towards the middle, I kind of missed a little bit of it, but really some valuable things. I like the where, why, so what, and the idea about connections and relationships, and the children's book that you shared that definitely can help at the elementary level tremendously. So I actually took away a lot. I also wrote a lot of things down as well, but definitely a great way of looking at geography.
SSELA has a lot of picture books that can be used in that regard. So once you're open to looking at geography in that way, there's all kinds of things there that you can play with.
All right, thanks again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good afternoon, folks, and a nice weekend.
You too.
Thank you again, Donna, for leading the learning today and for your passion and your interests. And folks, just be on the lookout for more great resources related to geography. Donna has been a great advocate for continuing to build those out, not only just in the way that they're teased out in the New York State framework, but really doing it in an authentic way that students and teachers can connect to. So Donna, it has been a pleasure spending this afternoon with you and diving into this. And as you said, what a great way to lead into a long weekend. And we'll be posting this video, so you'll all be able to access the full webinar and share it out with your colleagues. And we'll also be taking the presentation and also sharing that out as well. But thank you so much for your work, Donna, on this. And everyone have a wonderful weekend.
My pleasure. Take care, folks.
All right, be well, everyone. Thank you so much.